Boston, Massachusetts, winter of 2000. Snow clung to the sidewalks like silence. In Cambridge, where old brownstones still whispered stories of centuries past, a man appeared each December, always alone. He would stand across the street from a particular house, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the same front door, unmoving. Neighbors had gotten used to him. The old man in the cap, they called him. Quiet, harmless, ghostly. He never knocked, he never spoke, just stood there in the cold. Some winters it snowed heavily, and he'd remain there until the light faded from the sky. No one ever asked him why. Then, in early November of 2000, the house was sold. Emma Carter, a 30-something filmmaker from New York, had come to Boston for a slower life and a project she could call her own. The brownstone was aged, but full of character, brick walls, creaky floors, and a garden that hadn't been touched in decades. She saw history in it. She wanted to restore it, not just the wood and stone, but whatever story had been left behind. A few weeks into her renovations, on a grey morning, Emma began digging around the backyard to prepare for winter plantings. The soil was hard from frost. Her shovel hit something metal. Curious, she knelt down, brushed the dirt away, and pulled out a small, rusted object. It was a round medal, dull from time but clearly engraved, AK, and beneath it, 1944. That evening, as dusk crept in, Emma stood at her window, holding the medal in her hand. Across the street, he was there again. The same man, same coat, same silence. This time, though, their eyes met. For just a second, he seemed to recognize what she held. His shoulders sank, as if something long buried had shifted inside him. And then, just as quietly as he came, he turned and disappeared into the falling snow. Emma felt a weight she couldn't explain. Who was this man? What was this medal? And why had it been hidden beneath a tree, as if waiting to be remembered? She had come to restore a house. She hadn't expected to resurrect a story. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that move, surprise, and remember. And now, prepare yourself. What happens next will change everything. After that cold evening when her eyes met his through the window, Emma couldn't let it go. The man's face, that glance, the way his shoulders fell when he saw the medal, it haunted her. She left the object on her writing desk that night, wrapped in an old cloth. In the morning light, she studied it again. It was heavy for its size, not made of any precious metal, yet precious in meaning. AK and 1944. That was all. But it felt like a message buried in time. She began asking around. The local hardware store owner, Mr. Jeffers, remembered the man. He's been coming around every winter since I can remember. Quiet fella. Never talks to anyone. Used to teach, I think. Lost his wife a few years ago. Real old school guy. Emma thanked him and kept digging. She visited the Cambridge Public Library and began searching through old property records. The house, it turned out, had once belonged to a family named Jewishner, David, Ruth, and their teenage daughter, Lily. A Jewish family who had lived in the house until 1942. Then, nothing. The records stopped. The next owner appeared in 1945. No documents in between. It was as if they'd vanished, but Emma knew what that meant. She'd read enough, studied enough. 1942 was the year many Jewish families in the US were quietly relocated from urban neighborhoods, some for their safety, some due to quiet pressures no one talked about publicly. There were no camps here like in Europe, but there was fear, discrimination, deportation, silence. And this house, her house, had a story buried inside its brick and wood. She returned to the garden where she had found the medal and walked slowly along the fence. The apple tree stood crooked, its bark split in places from old age. She knelt beside it and pressed her palm into the earth. It was cold, but something about it felt alive. A few days later, she waited by the window again, and just as she hoped, he returned, Same coat, same cap, same stillness. This time, she went outside. "Excuse me," she said gently, approaching the sidewalk. He looked at her with wary eyes, but didn't move. "I think I found something that belongs to you," she added, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out the medal. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, without taking it from her, he whispered, "I buried that a long time ago. I never thought it would come back." "Were you in the war?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Resistance. I wasn't a soldier, not in uniform. I was a teacher. I delivered packages, messages, sometimes food, sometimes false names." Emma realized then he wasn't just part of the past. He had lived it in silence all these years. He gestured toward the house. "There was a girl," he said, voice strained. "Her name was Lily. I was supposed to help them, get them out. I waited all night, but they never came." The words came slowly, as if it pained him to unbury them. He looked at the tree. "That's where I left it. The medal. I told her if anything happened, I would come back. Every year. I thought maybe she would too." Emma didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She stood with him in silence. That night, she couldn't sleep. She printed every document she could find. Public records, birth certificates, property ledgers. She found one more piece, a photograph, black and white. A school group from 1941, a girl with long dark hair, a boy in a sweater vest beside her. Anton Koenig, that was his name. She returned to the window. Snow began to fall again. The next morning, she returned to the garden and began clearing away the dead leaves and branches that cluttered the fence. She planted nothing, just cleared space, as if making room for memory. The ground seemed softer now, almost willing to speak. She wrote a letter. "Mr. Koenig, I read about the Jewishner family. I think I understand what happened. You were just a boy. You tried, but maybe we don't have to carry silence anymore. Would you come back tomorrow? There's something I'd like you to see. Emma." She left the letter under a stone on the garden wall where she'd seen him pause before, and waited. Spring 1944 had not yet reached Cambridge. The snow had begun to melt, but the chill remained, clinging to alleyways and seeping beneath doors. The war raged across oceans, but in quiet corners of America, shadows crept in silence. There were whispers of people who had vanished, of names no longer spoken, and there was Anton. At 19, he was a teacher's assistant and a messenger for a local printing press. Officially, he delivered packages and correspondence. Unofficially, he carried food, ration books, and, on rare occasions, hope. He wasn't part of any formal resistance, not like in Europe, but he had joined a small circle of friends who helped those left behind when the world looked away. One such family was the Jewishners, David, Ruth, and their daughter, Lily. They had lived in the brownstone for years, known for hosting musical evenings and lending books to neighbors. Then, one day, they disappeared from public life. Rumors said they'd left the city, but Anton knew better. He brought them canned goods, paper, news. They lived in silence, hidden in their own basement. The shutters remained closed. Lights flickered only at night, behind heavy curtains. Lily was 17. She rarely spoke when Anton came, but her presence was unmistakable. She had dark hair, always tied back with a ribbon. Her eyes held more age than her years. She read poetry, Dickinson, Frost, Rilke in translation, and sometimes left him folded scraps of verse tucked into ration boxes. Their conversations were made of glances and brief exchanges. She once said, "If we were living in a poem, would we know the ending?" He had smiled but didn't answer. Some truths were too sharp to say aloud. By March, Anton knew it was time. The family couldn't stay there much longer. There were whispers of new neighborhood raids. A cousin of his worked at the Department of Records. He had managed to get blank identity cards. Anton spent nights forging names, birthdays, even a train ticket to Chicago. His plan was simple. He would get them out through the alley at midnight, walk them to a contact who would take them to a safe house. From there, they would vanish. The day before they were set to leave, he visited one last time. In the backyard, beneath the crooked apple tree, he and Lily stood in the dusk. She held a thin notebook of poems. "If I lose this," she said, "I'll lose all my words." "No, you won't," he replied, handing her a small parcel. Inside, new clothes, a different life. Then he pulled the medal from his coat pocket. Round, plain, engraved only with his initials, AK, and the year 1944. "It's nothing official," he said. "Just a thing I carry, but I want you to have it in case—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I can't carry anything more," she said. "If we're separated, leave it, hide it, somewhere only we would know." So he did. He took a small trowel and dug a hole beneath the tree. The soil was still half frozen, stubborn. When he placed the medal into the earth, he paused. "If you ever come back," he whispered, "it'll be waiting." That night, he waited in the alley behind the house. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. No sound, no movement. He dared not knock. By dawn, he approached the house. The door was ajar. Inside, dust, silence. No suitcases, no footprints. The basement was empty, as if no one had ever lived there. Anton never saw them again. He returned to the garden. The apple tree stood still in the wind. He placed a flat stone over the buried medal and stood there a long while. He didn't cry. He couldn't. He simply felt the weight of everything he hadn't said. Years passed. He moved, married, taught. But every winter he returned to that street. Always the same time, same place, same silence. Standing before the house, staring at the tree, waiting for something. He wasn't sure what. Forgiveness, maybe, closure, or just the memory of a promise he couldn't keep. Emma read pieces of this story from Anton's quiet confessions, not in speeches but in phrases, in the way he said her instead of a name, in the way he stood unmoving by the tree. She realized this wasn't just a story about loss. It was about the courage to remember, even when the world forgets. A week after they stood together in the snow, Anton invited Emma inside. It was a quiet afternoon. The air outside smelled like thawing earth, and the garden still wore its white coat like a memory refusing to melt. Inside his apartment, the warmth was modest, filled with books stacked unevenly, sepia-toned photographs, and the smell of old paper. Anton moved slowly now. His hands trembled not just with age, but with something deeper, something that had lived in him too long, without a voice. He led her to a small wooden cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a brass key he wore around his neck. Inside was a single leather-bound journal worn at the edges, the spine held together with tape and time. "I started it in 1945, he said, placing it in her hands. "Didn't think I'd still have it, or that anyone would ever read it." Emma hesitated, but he nodded. "You should." She opened it there, sitting on the arm of a quiet chair. The first page was dated April 12, 1945. The handwriting was steady, careful. No titles, no names, just a sentence. "Some silences weigh more than words," she read. He had begun writing not to remember, but to survive forgetting. His entries weren't daily, but scattered, pages from different decades, stitched together by guilt and longing. He never referred to Lily by name, only as her, or the girl with eyes like quiet water. He never blamed the world, only himself. "I stood at the tree again today," one entry began. "I thought maybe this time she would be there just for a second, but there was only wind." Another from 1963. "I taught my students about war today, told them stories from textbooks. Not the one about a 17-year-old girl who taught me how to listen without words. That story is still buried like the medal." Emma turned each page slowly. In the margins, sometimes he sketched. Trees a silhouette, once the medal itself. She could feel him in those lines, in the pauses between paragraphs. She reached a page written in the early 80s. "I married Maria in 56. She made me tea every morning for 30 years. I was grateful, but a part of me always stood outside that house in the snow. I think she knew. She never asked. No, there was sorrow, but no bitterness. Only an aching need to be understood by someone, even if they arrived 50 years too late. In one of the final entries, written in shaking script, he wrote, "If someone ever reads this, tell her I kept coming back. Tell her I tried, that I never stopped listening, even when the world moved on." Emma closed the book with trembling hands. The silence in the room was deep, but not empty. She looked at Anton. He wasn't watching her. His gaze was fixed on the window, on the grey sky and the tree line beyond. She realized then, this story had never been meant to be told through film or interviews. It was never about headlines or history books. It was about two people, one promise, one silence that had lived too long. "Do you want to go back?" she asked quietly. "To the house? To the tree?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, yes, but not alone. Emma returned home with the journal pressed to her chest. That night, she sat in the kitchen and wrote in her own notebook. Not a script, just thoughts. Fragments of things Anton had never said aloud, but had entrusted to ink and faith. She made tea, lit a candle, sat by the window as the garden froze again under new snow. The next day, she cleared a small path to the tree. She left nothing behind, only space. The ground felt lighter somehow, as if the earth itself was ready to release what had been hidden too long. The sky that morning was a pale, clean blue, stretched wide over a city still asleep beneath a layer of winter frost. And though the air was bitterly cold, the sun, low on the horizon, filtered through bare tree branches with a soft golden hue that seemed more like a blessing than light. Emma had risen early, made tea, and watched from her window as the frost on the glass slowly faded with the warmth inside, waiting for Anton's knock, not knowing if it would come, only hoping. When he arrived, wearing the same long grey coat and the flat cap she had come to associate with quiet resilience, she greeted him with a smile that held no pressure, no expectation, just presence. His steps were slower now, careful, the weight of the years he carried no longer hidden by posture or pride. They said very little as they walked through the house and out into the garden, but silence, in that moment, didn't mean absence. It meant understanding, and maybe something closer to reverence. The garden, blanketed by snow and trimmed in the delicate lace of frozen branches, felt more like a sacred place than it ever had before. The apple tree stood, as it always had, bent slightly to one side, its bark split in several places, its branches barren yet somehow dignified, like an old sentinel watching over untold stories buried beneath its roots. Anton stopped a few steps from the tree, and Emma instinctively stood back, allowing him to approach it alone. For a long moment he simply looked at it, not with the curiosity of someone returning to a familiar place, but with the hesitation of someone about to disturb something sacred, something that had been waiting patiently under soil and snow for far too long. He removed one glove, reached out, and placed his weathered hand gently on the trunk, as if feeling for a heartbeat. "This is where I left it," he said softly, his voice hoarse, the words folding into the wind like they too belonged to the past. "I buried it right here. I didn't know what else to do." Emma stepped beside him and handed him the small gardening spade she'd brought. But instead of taking it, he slowly knelt in the snow, pushing aside the frost with his bare hands. She joined him in silence, brushing the cold surface clear of snow until the earth, still frozen in places, showed patches of brown. Together they worked, slowly, patiently, without words, as if they feared that if they moved too quickly, the moment might break apart and vanish like breath in cold air. Finally, Anton struck something just beneath the surface. A smooth, flat stone, now crusted with years of soil and decay. His hand paused, trembling slightly, and he brushed the dirt aside until the edge of something round and metal caught the light. He lifted the medal. It was small, darkened by age, but the engraving was still there. AK and 1944, etched in the same hand that had once placed it into the ground with trembling resolve. Anton sat back on his heels, cradling the object in his palm, staring at it as if it were not just a token of the past, but the past itself, condensed into something he could finally hold again. For a long time, he said nothing. His eyes were wet, but no tears fell, not yet. "I thought," he began slowly, "that maybe, just maybe, if I came back often enough, if I waited long enough, she'd come too. That we'd meet here again, not with words, not even to explain, just to know we'd both survived." Emma didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her presence beside him said enough. "I was young," he continued. "I didn't understand what love meant, not then. But I knew she mattered. I knew she looked at me like I wasn't invisible, and I promised I'd come back. When I couldn't save her, this was all I could do." And then the tears came. Slowly at first, one by one, down his cheeks, carried into the snow where they disappeared as if even the earth wanted to hold that grief. He did not hide them. He did not speak over them. He let them fall in silence, letting the garden hear what no one else had for nearly 60 years. Emma reached out, placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and simply sat with him in the snow. The cold bit at their skin, but neither moved. The wind whispered through the trees above, and for a brief moment, the world around them felt suspended, paused in honor of a truth finally unearthed. After a while, Anton stood slowly, his knees stiff, his breath slow and heavy. He turned to Emma and placed the medal in her hand. "You should keep it now," he said. "It belongs with the story." She nodded, not with pride or sorrow, but with quiet respect. Then, reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a piece of red ribbon, soft and simple, and tied it carefully around one of the lower branches of the tree. It fluttered gently in the cold wind, a bright thread in a pale world. Anton looked at the ribbon, the tree, the earth that had held his silence for so long. "She would have liked that," he murmured. They walked back into the house slowly, not as two people who had completed something, but as two souls who had finally made room for grief to rest. Spring arrived quietly in Cambridge the following year, brushing past the rooftops with the first soft winds of April. The apple tree behind Emma's house bloomed timidly, its blossoms unfolding like memories long kept silent. Beneath it, the ground had thawed, the snow now only a distant thought. And yet, what had been unearthed that winter would never freeze again. A few weeks after their moment in the garden, Emma arranged a small gathering. It wasn't a public event, just a handful of neighbors, a local historian, and a few high school students who had helped her clear the path to the tree. In the middle of the garden, beside the apple's roots, stood a slender plaque, polished and simple. It read, "Here was buried a promise. Anton Koenig, teacher, witness, and keeper of memory. Lily Jewishner, poet, daughter, voice unheard. Their story lives, for silence must not." The medal itself was placed in a glass display at the Cambridge Historical Society beside a brief summary written by Emma, not a hero's tale, not a tragedy, just the quiet truth of a man who carried memory through winters, waiting not for glory, but for the chance to be seen. Anton attended the small ceremony. He sat quietly, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the ribbon tied to the tree. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His being there was enough. He passed away the following winter in his sleep as the snow returned gently to the streets he had walked for decades. He left behind no family, no fortune, only a collection of books, a worn-out journal, and one letter addressed to Emma. "Thank you for returning me to the garden, for listening, for making space where silence lived too long." She kept the letter in a wooden box in her study. Every spring, she tended the garden with new hands, but the same care. She didn't plant much, just enough to let the tree breathe, to keep the earth soft. Sometimes visitors came, students, Researchers, strangers who had seen the medal and wanted to know more. She told them the story, not with fanfare, but with gentleness, the kind of story you sit with. Because some stories don't ask to be told loudly. They ask to be felt, to be carried. The red ribbon still hangs from the lowest branch. It's weathered now, faded by time and sun, but still tied, still speaking. And every winter when the snow begins to fall, Emma lights a small lantern in the window, facing the garden. Not for ghosts, not for sorrow, but to remind anyone passing by that some promises, no matter how old, can still be honored. We share new stories every day, real stories that move and inspire. If this one touched you the way it touched us, please like and subscribe. Because memory matters, and sometimes remembering is the bravest thing of all.